My name is Mary Biddle-Koenig, and I am the Assistant Director of the Smith Enterprise Risk Consortium, or CERC as we call it, at the Robert H. Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland. I would like to welcome you to the November webinar of our monthly risk leadership series, sorry about that, which is brought to you by CERC, ZRG Partners, and Office of Executive Education at the Smith School of Business. As many of you already know, our webinars are focused on top-of-mind risk topics that vary from month to month. Last month, we talked about commercial real estate risk. Next month, we'll focus on climate risk with a debrief from the COP20. But today, we were going to delve into the supply chain disruptions and critical shortages in the U.S. pharmaceutical industry. To start us off, I would like to introduce you to Rob Iamazzo. Rob is Managing Director of ZRG Partners and currently leads ZRG's Global Enterprise Risk and Analytics practice. We have partnered with Rob for many years to bring you the Risk Leadership webinar series, and I'm pleased to turn it over to him to kick us off today. Thank you very much, Rob.
Good morning, Mary Biddle. Thank you. It's great to be here for yet another webinar series, and this time really to kick us off on supply chain risk management within the pharma space. As Mary Biddle mentioned, Robert Iamazzo with ZRG Partners. I lead our global enterprise risk and analytics practice, and it really is a true pleasure and an honor to be here amongst this distinguished crowd. Really excited with the partnership that we have with CERC that has historically been more focused in financial services and is now broadening within the pharma space, specifically to supply chain risk. And to that, would like to introduce the moderator of today's webinar, Sandy, who is an emeritus professor of supply chain management at the Business School of Robert H. Smith in University of Maryland. Over to you, Sandy.
Well, thank you very much, Mary Biddle and Rob. Appreciate it. And we're very fortunate today to have three individuals from the pharma space. Each brings a very unique perspective on the drug shortages that we're currently facing as a nation. And I'd like to briefly introduce them and then kind of set the stage for the conversation that's going to follow. So allow me to introduce, first of all, Dov Garden. Dov, there you are. And Dov is highly experienced enterprise risk management executive. He has over 20 years of experience in building and managing corporate resiliency programs. We're very fortunate to have him as part of this discussion. Currently, he's the Vice President of Enterprise Risk for Catalent Pharma Solutions. And for those of you in the space, I'm sure you know that Catalent is a really major contract development and manufacturing organization. And so he's very well aware of the entire supply chain of drug manufacturing and distribution. And again, thank you so much for participating, Dov. Appreciate it.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Our second participant is Stuart Glickman. Stuart is a member of the CERC. He's also, very proud to say, a graduate of the MBA program at Smith. And he is, again, highly experienced. He's a vice president of global supply chain for Emergent Biosolutions in Gaithersburg. He has also been the vice president of supply chain transformation for AbbVie, which became Allergan, and he became the vice president of supply chain for Allergan. So as an operating global supply chain executive, he has a broad range of experiences in day-to-day operations and strategic planning of the supply chain network. So thanks, Stuart. Appreciate you being here today.
My pleasure.
And then finally, our last participant is someone we discovered, and we're very happy to have discovered and brought him into the conversation today. And that's Kerry Engels. And Kerry had a very unusual background. Let us say this. He's had 30 years in nuclear submarines, learning the ins and outs of the management of a very difficult, complex logistics environment. These kinds of skills got him to a position for Amgen, where he monitored their site operations and was their head of site operations worldwide. He also had a very intense experience in his time period in Puerto Rico from August 2016 to 2019, which overlapped with Hurricane Maria. And at the time, Amgen had some 2,700 employees, I believe, on the island. It was the largest manufacturer on the island. And it survived a hurricane, Category 5 hurricane, killed 3,000 people, and left over $91 billion in damage, and knocked out the infrastructure of the island for almost a year. This, of course, since Puerto Rico provides about 50% of US pharmaceutical profits out of the island, it created havoc with drug shortages nationwide. And just as an example, 50% of US hospitals suffered saline solution shortage as a result of Hurricane Maria and its impact on Puerto Rico. So we're very excited to hear from you, Carrie, and to try to understand what you learned from that really monumental environmental and climate risk that faced the supply chain of the pharma industry. So I think that without further ado, we kind of want to get into the substance of what we're going to talk about today. And let me just have a couple of introductory remarks, if you'll be so kind. The pharmaceutical industry today has over 300 active drugs that are in shortage. This is the highest in over a decade. In August 2023, the American Society of Health Systems pharmacists, there was a survey done of 1,000 respondents, and 99% of hospital pharmacists in this study said that the shortages that they're experiencing are negatively impacting patient care. And a third of those pharmacists say that the drug shortage impacts are critical. A separate survey of cancer centers in June 23 found that 93% reported carboplatin and cisplatin shortages, which are used for many types of cancer. So cancer patients are experiencing these shortages very, very dramatically. And overall, one of our partners at the Smith School, Resilink, a supply chain risk management tracking company, reported that in the first half of 2023, there were 8,197 supply chain disruptions, and life sciences and healthcare were the industries with the highest number of these disruptions. So my starting question to our very experienced panelists is this. Given your individual perspectives as a risk manager, as an operations executive, as a strategist, how do you see the causes and the impacts of these kinds of shortages?
To go first. I'll jump in. So, I mean, obviously, there's a lot of complexity here in terms of what is causing the drivers. I think there are a lot of macroeconomic. You read substantial articles around incentives in the generic space, especially, where cost has been taken out to the extent there's not a lot of room for investment in resiliency and redundancy. There are issues with active pharmaceutical ingredients that are well publicized. There are issues with excipients that are probably not as well publicized. But if you can't get all of the ingredients, you can't make the product. There's been conversations about onshoring or offshoring in decades past and onshoring now. So I think broadly there's a lot of factors involved, but it's up to us to figure out how to improve the resiliency of the supply chain, because ultimately a more robust supply chain is more resistant to disruption.
I would add to that, you can't just swap out components, materials, ingredients out of a drug. And so if you've got, I don't know, 50, 60, 20 even, doesn't matter, components, excipients, APIs that go into a particular drug, and there's a shortage or an issue with one of them, you're dead in the water, because you know the regulatory process for changing an ingredient in a drug is so long. And so it's a very delicate supply chain, I would say. And to Stuart's point, virtually everything that goes on globally can impact those ingredients that go into your drugs. I'll give you an example, something that's happening now with Ukraine and Russia. Sunflower seed oil comes from, a lot of it comes from the Ukraine. And there was, with the port issues when Russia invaded, there was a shortage of that. We put sunflower seed oil in a lot of our gummy and soft gel drugs that we produce for our partners, for our customers. And so luckily we had somebody who just almost by mistake noticed a huge kind of barrel of it. One of our key manufacturing plants was able to say, whoa, do you guys know where that's from? You should stock up. And we were able to stock up and have enough. But the message here is that's not an active ingredient. That's not one that's going to come across the news, but it's one that could very negatively impact our ability to manufacture to demand.
Doug, I was fascinated by something you had mentioned to me about the horseshoe crab and issues with the horseshoe crab as a sourcing problem.
Yeah, horseshoe crabs. If people are on the East Coast, you're familiar with those really weird, crazy looking. They almost look like, I don't know, tanks or something. But horseshoe crab blood is used for testing for contamination and aseptic processing. And there's been a decline in the horseshoe crab population. Global warming could lead to greater declines. This is more of an emerging potential risk. And there have been attempts to create synthetic versions of this that have not passed, unless something new has happened. Stuart, I don't know if you're aware, but there have been attempts, but right now that is the only thing you can use to test for certain contaminants in aseptic processing. And that's something I've been just kind of keeping in the back of my mind for a long time, because if the EPA comes in and says, well, now these are endangered animals, or any number of reasons, right, to cause a shortage in the supply of horseshoe crab blood, which is blue, by the way, it's fascinating, it's blue blood. But anyway, horseshoe crab blood, then that could create a huge problem for any kind of aseptic processing anywhere.
Sandy, I was just going to add,
Please, Gary.
I think it would be interesting to matrix shortages and try to pin down root causes of shortages and see what common elements there are. I would be willing to bet that there'd be a lot of question marks on that matrix because number one, it's not always one thing. Number two, it's not always clear. There's an amoxicillin powder shortage in the United States right now, which is critical for children. And the article I was reading on that particular shortage was very unsatisfying in that it did not pin down the root cause of the amoxicillin shortage. And not in this industry, but this morning there's a shortage of milk in the United States due to packaging problems. So these things pop up from time to time, and we've all noticed that the world has not become more cohesive. It's become less cohesive. We're less in control of some of the variables affecting our supply chains, often surprised by some of those variables affecting our supply chain. So it'd be great if it were easy to pin these things down, but these are some of the reasons I'm a huge fan of controlling as many aspects of our manufacturing, from excipients and raw materials to final product and distribution, as possible. Just it's so hard in this space to get it all in one can.
Yeah,
So Carrie, sorry, I just wanted to, if you don't mind, just follow up on something you had said previously, where you had talked about zero notice risks, and I found that a really interesting term. Do you want to elaborate about that a bit?
Yep, sure. So, and I'm not the seasoned professional that the other two gentlemen on this panel are when it comes to analyzing risk. I certainly am a practitioner. So, the risks that face our industry might be no notice. A no notice might be an earthquake, a fire. Short notice might be a hurricane, which in the case of Hurricane Maria and more recently Otis, these storms went from a concerning tropical storm to a definitely life-threatening, devastating Cat 5 hurricane in the span of a couple of days. And even for a hurricane, there's no time to get ready, to think through your risk mitigation plan, to invest in infrastructure. It's here now. Unrest such as we see in the Middle East now and in Ukraine, those were not overnight problems. They were simmering problems that have come into full view and full impact now. But even then, if you're not ready for what's coming, and if you don't thoughtfully anticipate just how vulnerable your supply chain is, and not give lip service to risk assessment, but seriously contemplate what stakes, what outcomes can we tolerate on behalf of patients? Maybe the answer is none. So it definitely affects the investments we make, but the time element is short in most of these, and in some aspects it's getting shorter if we are able to attribute, for example, climate change to the frequency and ferocity of storms.
Harry, you and I might disagree a little bit on the concept of some of these no-notice risks, because if you are in an earthquake zone, if that's where you're manufacturing, if that's a sole source or a single source for a critical supplier. Same thing with hurricanes. I think it always comes back to the point, not always, but often comes back to the point Stuart made earlier about there not being resources to prepare, to your point, Carrie, for these things that may actually be known. I mean, I talk about COVID. People talk about COVID as being this black swan event that nobody could have guessed would have happened. Well, those of us in the industry were not terribly surprised. We were heavily impacted like everyone was, but that's why we put in place business continuity plans. That's why we do the risk assessments, so that we have a plan and at least a starting point when these kinds of things happen. Pandemics aren't new. The scale of this one isn't even new when you go back 100 years. It's a matter of a company or an organization being willing to invest in resources for something that might not happen for another 100 years. And that's that balance of how much risk are we willing to take? What can we do sort of that's not, we can't build extra manufacturing plants. The cost is obviously just too high for that. So then the question is what are some of the other things we can do to try and mitigate the risks, or at least mitigate the impact of the risks? That's really where the focus has to be. And I think, again, to your point, Carrie, there's so many variables to what could be causing a disruption. I look at the sort of social variable of the shortage for drugs like Ritalin that treat ADD, ADHD. A lot of that had to do with telehealth, and combined with the mental health issues that popped up during COVID when kids were at home, and the ease with which telehealth mental health professionals could just prescribe drugs. So the shortage was almost something that we created socially. Had nothing to do with a shortage of ingredients. It had nothing to do with quotas that the DEA puts on the industry. It has everything to do with something that was kind of an unintended consequence of the actions that we took during COVID. And so I think it's such a broad reaching question, and there's so many variables involved that we try and control as much as we can. But yeah, it's a challenging one.
Yeah, Dove, I actually don't think we would disagree. I think we are perfectly aligned. My point on the time element of the onset of crisis is that you can't get religion when the earthquake hits. Right. You absolutely must have invested and thought through what is it that we want and I'll get into some more of this, Sandy, maybe when we talk a little bit more about Hurricane Maria. But let's just take the simple example of power generation for your facility in a known earthquake zone. knowing exactly what it is you want that power generation to do, to accomplish, is critical. And extrapolating what worst case outcome it might be faced with. And just to finish off that point, you know, if you want to keep the lights on and maybe run an air conditioner, that's one thing. If you want to manufacture medicine to ensure that cancer patients get the medicine they need, then in the case of Puerto Rico, you'd better have enough power to run the entire site. And in our case, we were without civil power for 4 months and had to run our own trucking company and truck 3 million gallons of diesel fuel to keep that going. And not every company has the means, frankly, to undertake that sort of endeavor. So you're absolutely right. You know where you are. You know if you're in an earthquake zone, if tornadoes are possible where you are, and so on. And fires can hit anybody.
Sandy, I want to
Yeah, please.
highlight something you quoted earlier about the 8,000 disruptions monitored by Resolink. And just to highlight the complexity that we've been talking about here. So there's 8,000 disruptions. What does that mean to me? And so maybe the disruption is irrelevant because I'm sitting on 9 months of inventory and the disruption is going to last a month and it's no problem. Maybe the disruption is to a precursor to my ingredients, use the horseshoe crabs as an example, N-3 or 5 nodes up the supply chain. And I have no idea what that impact is until 9 months later when I go try to place an order for my excipient, which I just take for granted, and it's not available. And so understanding the complexity of the supply chain, we've spent a lot of time on hurricanes and earthquakes, which is things we want to guard against. But often it's the ingredient you take for granted that has the impact, that has the most impact. And just understanding how all these things fit together and making sense of the data that exists in a way that you can take action, I think is a very, very big challenge for these very complex supply chains.
Yeah, just a real quick comment. In my teaching role, I taught for many years the case of MasterCard and their creation of a pandemic response organization worldwide. And they had hired an epidemiologist, and as a result of the Asian flu and the period disruptions it caused in supply chains. And so they had a whole worldwide plan for pandemic response, including infrastructure that got activated for at-home work. So to Dove's point about having the resources to, actually put in such an organization, it is very resource intensive, no question about that. And going back to a point you raised, Stuart, which I'd like to kind of pursue just a little bit, if you don't mind. We talked about the issue of just-in-time inventory, just-in-time supply chain, and how that fits into this risk environment we're facing right now. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, from my standpoint, I don't want anything to do with just-in-time. That's not the business. That's not the pharmaceutical business. In general, we have large margins, and we need to protect inventory. Now, you got to find the right amount of inventory. You don't want to hoard inventory and be negligent with working capital, but you got to find the right balance there. And again, where the margins are higher, you're going to hold more inventory because it's a natural economic discussion. The challenge becomes where the margins are really low. When you've commoditized generic pharmaceuticals, you've commoditized them. There's not enough profit. There's not enough cash being thrown off from the revenue that allows you to invest in that working capital. And those are you're having much harder conversations about the amount of inventory you're willing to hold.
I'll say to the credit of everywhere I've been, and Stuart and I work together at Allergan very closely. One of the other elements to add, Stuart, to your point that we do want to look at is drugs that may not have those big margins, but that are life-changing or critical life-saving drugs for patients. And that was something we always looked at Allergan and not just Allergan, everywhere that I've worked is it's not just about the money, it's also about the patient. And that's something that I think is critical when you're looking at investing in resiliency is it's not just about those two things. It could be something that's not yet profitable, but that has a lot of strategic value for the organization. So it's important that when you're planning for resiliency, you're focusing on the most critical things. You can't focus on everything, but that you're taking into account profitability, but also life-saving ability and strategic need.
Okay. I had reflected a little bit on something you said, Stuart, and I was hoping you could sort of come back to it. And maybe our other participants could comment on it as well. You had talked about, when you and I had discussed this, the notion of supply chain evaporation, which I found a fascinating term, supply chain evaporation, and you linked it to accelerating climate risks. And so I was curious if you might expand on that a little bit, and how you see the landscape disruption really changing.
Yeah, I don't recall me saying the word evaporation. Maybe it's someone else, but
Yeah.
I think the concept is, look, we've been talking about that in this conversation. Take for a second, take climate change out. We are continually assessing where our risks are. Is this raw material at greater risk of disruption than that raw material? Is this region of the country or region of the world where we're sourcing from at greater risk than another area? And kind of back to the point we were just talking about, you can't solve everything. So you have to pick where you're going to make your investments in robustness, in resiliency, and redundancy. Climate change, to me, just adds another level of another accelerator, right? It's similar types of conversations. Where is our risk? What risk are we looking to mitigate? How do we prioritize? And you've brought in, you can't necessarily look backwards at the profile, because you're going to have disproportionate impacts in certain materials and certain geographies, kind of to Doe's point with the horseshoe crab. And so you have to put a different lens, but on the same theme.
How does climate change factor into when you do risk prioritization? Has climate change moved the needle significantly, and do you see that continuing to be so high profile?
Well, again, I'd say for the companies I've worked for, it's been more base understanding, mapping where our risks are, and trying to put climate change on top of that, as opposed to saying we have climate change driven risk assessments. To me, it's another variable in the overall equation.
Yeah, and I would kind of double down on that and say climate change is something that's happening. Excuse me. What does that mean for us from a risk perspective?
Mm-hmm.
So it's the same thing with weather. It's the same thing with war. These are all things that happen. What makes them a risk is that there's a direct threat to an asset that we have because we're vulnerable in some way, and that leads to an impact that is meaningful for us. So we're going to look across all variables when we're trying to understand risk to the supply chain, risk to whatever category of risk we're looking at. Climate change becomes an important variable in it, but by itself, it's not climate change driven risk, I guess, to Stuart's point.
Okay. Carrie, do you want to comment on that?
I would say the same. 13 years ago, when we were setting up or modernizing, we thought the enterprise risk management profile, if you will, at Amgen, I don't even remember discussing climate change as a factor. I'm sure now we would, but back then we didn't, and it wasn't that long ago.
Yeah, it's certainly moved. It's moving quickly, and I certainly see it as an accelerative risk. And it just makes, I'm sure, your lives a lot more difficult. Continue to do so. So I think we've kind of covered the risk landscape here and some of the causes of it, some of the factors in it. And if you don't mind, I'd like to kind of move to a different question now, which is, what can pharma companies do better to ensure a reliable and continuous supply of drug product to consumers, given all of these risks, given all these accelerating factors?
to me, it's eyes wide open, right? It's understanding what your supply network looks like, and whether it's a raw material supply or manufacturing process robustness or lab supplies, every element of it factors in. And for me, the focus is on robustness. Do I have a robust supply chain? And that might require redundancy. It might require safety stock. It might require better processes. It might require changes to my raw material specifications, so I'm better able to accept various vendor inputs. But to Carrie's point earlier, we talked about what are the causes. It's usually not. Usually, you don't have a disruption in your supply because of one issue. It's multiple issues stacked together. And understanding where you have risk and what you can do, what is appropriate to solve that risk versus appropriate to solve a different risk, to me, is eyes wide open, understanding what the issues are, and picking where we're going to make our investments to do the mitigation.
I think that's spot on. I like that, sort of applying that term eyes wide open. I think in the pharma industry, you need to have very robust risk management programs and resiliency programs focusing on business continuity, crisis management, that in an objective way allow you to understand what are those things that could cause a disruption wherever it is in the process. And it's got to start early on. If you're an organization that does development, R&D, it has to start with R&D. That was one of the challenges at Allergan was, but in a lot of places, I think, is R&D is driven by creating a successful product ultimately, right? And to do that, it's about time and money often. How quickly can we get that to the table, and how cheaply can we do it? Because most R&D doesn't actually lead to anything commercial. So when you're at phase 3, for example, if you're now at whatever that confidence level is that you're going to be moving something into commercial production, you should be already putting in place the right suppliers. You should be risk assessing every element of that drug as if it were already in commercial manufacturing, so that it doesn't transfer over. I'm sorry, there was a child screaming in the background. I don't know if you guys can hear that. So you're not transferring over something that adds risk because R&D used a supplier that doesn't have the capacity to match demand in commercial manufacturing. So now you've got a capacity risk, a scaling risk, etc. The point I'm making is you need to have these robust processes in place from the beginning and all the way through the life cycle of the drug. And then it's more than just having the processes in place. Sure, I run ERM for Catalent. The business has to be willing to say, okay, eyes wide open, we see what you're saying here, and we understand that there are risks we need to mitigate, and that's going to take some investment. So I think it's kind of this multi-layered end-to-end approach that needs to be put in place for pharma companies.
Yeah, good comments, Dov and Stuart. I just want to ask a couple of rhetorical questions and let the listeners look in their hearts and answer for themselves. To what degree is enterprise risk management in your company a top priority, or is it not sexy enough to make it to that level? I mean, it's sexy obviously with Stuart and Dov here, this is a sexy art, but to what degree do we have an enterprise risk management program because we know we need one, and to what degree are we truly committed to the program and truly back to the eyes wide open, accepting of significant possibilities that would disrupt, maybe take away our business. And I really think that companies ought to leadership ought to ask themselves that question. And I would expect the boards of these companies to be quite interested in this question. And of course, the boards are enablers in that as Dove pointed out, it takes resources to be ready. And so I think it's something that if a company isn't committed, there's an opportunity to enhance the robustness of the supply chain. I mean, we've got a lot of tools and they're getting better on supply chain awareness. I get all that, but this issue of investing in the worst possibility and practicing it and being committed to it, not as something that we do once a year, but something that we're living as part of our mission to serve patients, is critical.
I think that's an excellent point, and I want to come back to that in a few minutes, Gary, and hopefully you can kind of describe to us sort of the experience that you had down in Puerto Rico, which again, I think it was a very important experience for us to discuss a bit of. But Stuart, I want to focus on something that I think I understood you saying when we discussed this previously. You kind of focused in on cross-border supply chain security and what that meant during the pandemic, for example, and how you see that now. What steps can companies take given some of the problems that we've experienced?
So, look, the longer the supply chain, the more difficult it is to manage. And I think the more borders you cross, the more complexity you get, especially in the pandemic where you had countries just not exporting, right? We're not going to export, we're going to keep it for us. And so you have to be concerned about that from national health, national security. So how much can you, and I think you see a trend now, and I mentioned this earlier, towards reshoring, right? Bringing manufacturing back here. The challenge, of course, is you can do your final assembly here, your final drug product or drug substance manufacturing, but likely you're still going to be reliant on raw materials coming from all over the world. Dove talked about the oil in Ukraine. Yep. And so do you think about it more as an inventory staging play? Well, then you have expiration date of materials, and how do you think about that? So look, we're in a globalized world. We wouldn't have the products we have without the nature of the globalized world. And I think it's more about like we were saying earlier, it's about understanding where those risks are and mitigating them to the extent you can, where you think those risks become likely to become problematic.
You know, I'd add sometimes mitigations don't cost all that much money and can give you an edge over your competitors as well. And, you know, I've got some examples, I won't go into them right now, but where, well, I will, maybe one if you're a short one, for pharma grade silicone for a product that was a big product over at Allergan. The pharma grade silicone, like 90% of the world's supply is made by one company out of California. They have 2 manufacturing plants, and both of them are right in wildfire zones. In fact, one of them had a wildfire come up virtually up to the gates. And I asked the question at the manufacturing facility that used this primarily for the product. And I said, well, wait, hang on a second. Like, what happens if next year the fire goes past the gates and there's significant damage to the building? You don't have a lot of safety stock here. And there aren't really alternates. And the GM said, well, if that impacts us, it's going to impact all of our competitors as well. And my thought was that can't be the best case scenario. The best case scenario is we're prepared and we can figure out how to do that, right? We talk through, where safety stock is stored, increasing safety stock, a bunch of different kinds of not that expensive mitigations, but you can point to having a competitive edge by being more resilient than your competitors. I mean, there's a lot of examples out there where companies that were prepared, invested in risk management and resiliency planning, came out ahead following some sort of, industry-wide disruption. So I think it's important that that's part of the conversation. It's not just about, well, we're just spending money to store extra product, we're tying up cash, we're investing in redundancy when we want to run as close to capacity as we can. You're paying for a competitive edge as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I think that maybe this is a good time to kind of raise the issue of Amgen in Puerto Rico, because it really was an existential threat. I think 90% of the product, as I understood it, Amgen came from Puerto Rico at one point. There was 5 plants, 13 different drugs. And when the hurricane came along, it was really an existential threat to Amgen. It was beyond, you know, 1 or 2 components or products. It was your entire operation on the island. So, Carrie, I was wondering, what did you take away from all of that experience? That was one of the very first examples, I think, in the world of climate change completely collapsing a society. And I say this with a lot of personal sadness because my wife is from Puerto Rico. I saw what it did to the island. I used to work on the island. Before I came to the University of Maryland, I lived in Puerto Rico for 12 years. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from. What's the personal human dimensions of this? How did you respond? How did you get through this and your people get through this?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'd say out of all of the elements of preparation, and Amgen, well before my time, had both the resources and the foresight to make significant investments in the site, not just in the site, but in the network. And I can go through those later if we have time. But the one thing I would say about the network is Amgen acquired a site in Ireland. I actually led that site before I went to Puerto Rico. And that site was intended to provide redundancy, especially in syringe filling, provide redundancy for Puerto Rico. In fact, we built a twin filling line in Ireland in the event that we had a problem in Puerto Rico because of the significant volume. Anybody who hasn't had the privilege of serving patients from Puerto Rico has missed an opportunity to really enjoy teamwork that is both professional and affectionate and really, really rewarding. I had made a list, Sandy, of lessons learned, and the biggest lesson learned actually was don't forget the people. When we plan risk management, we tend to think about suppliers, raw materials, infrastructure investments, and Amgen did a brilliant job of all of that. I don't know to what degree companies understand or appreciate in advance that the center of gravity for recovery following a major catastrophe, and this was a catastrophe for everyone, the center of gravity for recovery is the human element, is the people. And that takes some serious thought, and it takes on a number of different dimensions. So, for example, during the storm, we had about 100 people on site. Most people needed to be and wanted to be with their families, and I would say the 100 people we had on site wanted to be with their families as well. But we had a lot of responsibilities on site. In fact, we were manufacturing up until about 6 hours before the eye wall came to Juncos. But you know, folks at home then needed a lot of things, and the factories were not going to recover themselves. And so folks needed to be able to take care of their families, to provide for their food. We had no telephones. We had no way of withdrawing money from an ATM. Everything was down. We had no potable water outside the site. We had no refrigeration. So, you know, elderly parents whose medicines need to be chilled was a concern. We had limited food on the site. So, you know, I couldn't feed or care for 2,700 people and their families on the site. But believe me, they all would have come to help if they could have. So we had to make hard decisions about who we wanted to bring in to recover the factories and how we were going to take care of them and how we were going to take care of the folks who we didn't want on the site immediately. We still wanted to take care of them. So our infrastructure permitted us to send people home with gallons of fresh water, pounds of ice. We did laundry for the staff so that they would, and of course that's critical in a biopharma environment, that folks are able to take care of their personal hygiene. We did a lot of things, but taking care of the people, of the human beings, is not cheap, and it's critical. And I would go so far as to say the community around us as well was really important to help the community. Our primary help for them was in providing potable water, because we had 4 water wells and could generate on the order of 400,000 gallons of fresh water a day, much of which is ultimately needed, of course, in manufacturing. But that's a fundamental human need, obviously, and we helped the community where we could. So if there's one lesson learned, it's game out what we can do for our team so that they in turn can help us recover the facility and get back online as fast as possible.
I think that's a really profound lesson. I have to tell you, in our research in supply chain risk, when we examined, almost did a forensic analysis of Hurricane Katrina, we found that Unilever was the first to restore manufacturing after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. And the interviews we did revealed the same thing that the executives that you just revealed. They had to build temporary housing on site. They had to arrange convoys for employees to get to the site. So taking care of, the human dimension was really critical to them being first to manufacture after Katrina. So I just want to emphasize and thank you for that point. I think that's very important.
Sandy?
Dov, yeah, please.
Let me just, sorry to interrupt you. Let me just add one other thing. Not only was that critical to and incredibly valuable to patients, to the patients we were serving, but if you want to experience the joy of working in an environment where employees, through their actions, express gratitude and loyalty and respect for their employer, that's an opportunity. It's the right thing to do, and it reaps all kinds of benefits that could reasonably, logically extend to a competitive advantage for your company or your facility when you take care of people in that way. It was really a big deal in Puerto Rico. It
was a very big deal. And I had relatives at that HomeQuest plant, so I know it was a very big deal. And I thank you. I want
to add. Well, first of all, that's incredible. Just in the few minutes we've been talking in previous conversations, the stories you've shared are absolutely incredible on a human level, beyond anything. But for me, the takeaway when I think about supply chain risk is Amgen made a decision to put a factory in a location that has higher risk of hurricanes and than other areas, but made the investment in time and money to address that choice. That's a lesson for all of us, is there are ramifications for the choices that you take when you source manufacturing locations, whether it's a plant or whether it's an outsourced partner or whatever. There are choices that you make, and you need to assess the impact of those choices, or you're going to be left out to dry. And so my takeaway is Amgen did the right thing and reaped the benefit of that. We need to be thinking about that continually as we source pharmaceuticals and any other materials.
Good point. Dov, do you want to comment at all?
No, I mean, it's such a fantastic story, and it's such a great example of what the power of good risk management can do for your company. And it kind of reminds me a little bit of Hurricane Sandy. I was working with Novartis as a consultant at the time, and they did something very similar. It wasn't planned; it was kind of ad hoc, because who saw Sandy coming? But they opened up the campus to all their employees and their families to get a hot meal, to take a hot shower, If you recall, there were these massive power outages. In some cases, it took weeks to restore the power. And so they provided fresh water, they provided, all the resources that a large company can put forth. And they also had a similar program whereby if your property was damaged via earthquake or some other significant event, they could forward money, just cash, which was also really critical in a time when, card readers aren't working and you need to pay for things with cash. And so what that generates is a tremendous amount of employee loyalty. And I'd say it's so critical now, especially in our current talent environment where it is hard to find talent. It's hard to keep talent because there's so much opportunity today. That may change in the future, but there will always be periods of competition for talent. And to Carrie's point, keeping your people safe, looking after them, it generates a lot of loyalty, and that goes a long way. And it's talent is also an accelerator for risk, because if your talent's not happy, right, they're leaving, and so you can't get things done, or they're not doing a great job because they're unhappy, and that could impact quality, it could impact all kinds of things that then lead to direct shortages. So I think that's what's so, I think, striking for me about Carrie's story is the criticality of looking after your people.
That's great. Thank you for your comments. Well, we're moving into the end stage of the discussion here, and I think that maybe it would be good just to touch for a moment on one thing, which is mostly we focused on the industry itself, the pharma industry itself up till now. But I think it'd be good to get your comments on what changes in government regulation and policy do you think are needed to support the industry? I mean, a number of studies have come out. The Senate Homeland Security Committee, Duke just recently issued another study calling for, support for advanced manufacturing, for better management, measurement and tracking mechanisms for drugs. Are these sufficient? What's your take on how government can best help alleviate these really critical drug shortages we're facing?
This is not my expertise, right? I'm not a public policy person, but I started earlier this hour talking about some of the disincentives in the generic space because of pricing. It's 90 some percent, right? It's high 80s or low 90s of the prescriptions dispensed in this country are generic. I think that's the biggest issue, is making sure that the proper incentives are right, so that there's enough money to invest in more robust supply chains for these commoditized generic drugs. I think that's going to be the biggest lever that can be pulled.
Would you say that that's sort of part of the home shoring concept, or do you think it's not necessarily possible?
Look, if you have really tight margins, if you've commoditized products that were never intended to be commodities, then it doesn't matter where you're making them. Certainly, if they're made in the U.S., you've taken away some supply chain risk, right? It's a shorter supply chain, less complexity, but that doesn't solve the problem.
Okay.
I worry that it's not even a band-aid, but it can create a false sense of security that, oh, we've onshored, so now we don't need to invest in risk management anymore, or we can invest less because from the government perspective, we've done what we're supposed to do, and and now we've eliminated our risk. And I think that's a very dangerous perspective. Because to Stuart's point, I mean, at some point in your supply chain, things come from other countries and they have to get here. And it doesn't really matter if you're doing your final manufacturing, your assembly, or whatever here. The sunflower oil is still going to come from the Ukraine. That's just where it is. And so I think this idea of onshoring creates a little bit of a false sense of security. Yeah, I had another point to Stuart's, but I kind of lost it. So
Okay.
Need my second
Kerry.
coffee for the game.
And Kerry, I guess you get the last word on this.
Agree with both of my colleagues. Two areas where I'm particularly focused right now in terms of interest, and one of them is strategic stockpiling, which the government is particularly good at, and that might be able to help, especially where margins are so low that some companies are not particularly interested in producing some of these essential products, and there are efforts underway here. And the other one is from a crisis response standpoint. I'm watching real carefully this issue of concept of distributed manufacturing, especially in times of crisis, or mobile manufacturing, which the agency, I think it was last year, issued a paper for comment on how to regulate mobile manufacturing or distributed manufacturing, which might be very helpful in a crisis response setting. So there are two areas that I'm particularly interested in at the moment.
Well, that's great. So I guess we are sort of wrapping it up at this stage. Thank you all for your comments. We've covered a lot of ground. We've covered risk landscape for drug shortages. We've covered risk responses to the drug shortages, and we just got done talking a little bit about government support of the industry to help alleviate these drug shortages. So if we have any questions from the audience of the webinar, please share them now. And I don't see any open questions. So what I would suggest, if there are no questions, that maybe we take just a few seconds to wrap up and give each of you just a minute or so to whatever final thoughts you may have for the audience. Okay. And Dov, let me start with you again, and we'll work our way around.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's really important to communicate the advantages that a solid risk management program or robust risk management program brings to an organization, not just in, well, if the worst case scenario happens, we're prepared, but beyond that, with competitive advantage, with keeping your talent, your people protected, safe, and supported. There are huge benefits, and it's hard to quantify them. One way you quantify them is just looking at insurance. That's been something I've been able to use in the past to accurately communicate our risk to insurance companies. Has actually shown to reduce premiums. So, but I think the message here is look, there's a lot of things that can go wrong, especially in our industry, and you've got to be as prepared as possible. And then that means having a robust program.
Good summary. And Stuart, how about yourself?
I think it's about understanding your risk profile, and Dov mentioned it, I think, at the beginning, risk appetite. I don't know if you use those words, but understanding your situation, your profile, because you can't solve everything. And so if you understand it, if you assess risk properly, you put your money and your time and your resources into those things that are the most likely or the most impactful. And so being thoughtful about where you invest.
Okay. And Kerry, before you answer, I'm going to kind of put you on the spot here. A question came in, and as you were speaking, Stuart, so maybe you can address that. We only have a few seconds left. What are some of the ethical barriers faced in your line of work? That is the question that came in. Okay. Try to summarize that in under 30 minutes. Do the best you can, Kerry.
Ethical barriers?
Yes, it's an interesting question, isn't it?
Well, I'll tell you that in the middle of a crisis, somebody is going to come out of the woodwork and try to balance their budget. And I would recommend kicking them out of your office. The cost of recovering is far lower than the cost of failing. And so, keeping, as I said earlier, taking care of people, to me, is the center of gravity. It's the primary element. I guess I'd say one more. After Hurricane Maria, there was this atmosphere, I guess in Washington, I had my hands full, but I understood in Washington that there was this atmosphere, perhaps by the FDA commissioner, that some companies were not being completely transparent with the state of their facilities and their ability to recover. We, of course, were. We had FDA regulators show up at the site 2 days after the storm, which actually surprised me, but I wasn't embarrassed about anything that we were doing. And you know, if somebody wasn't ready, if you will, for the regulators to show up, it wasn't an inspection in the traditional sense, but they have a critical role to do. They play a critical role in our ecosystem. And as a patient and family member of patients, we want them to do a good job. So it's a good time to be open, especially open and transparent, not circle the wagons and try to conceal or limit information.
Great response. And we can obviously spend half the day talking about this issue. It's very complicated, but our time has run out. And so I would like to thank everyone. Carrie, thank you for participating. Dov, Stuart, it's a pleasure to meet you both. And thank you so much for participating. And thank you to CERC. And at this point, we're going to sign off. Take care, everyone.
Thanks.